Not every baby is born crying. Some arrive in silence and leave even quieter. My name is Dorothy Jean Sinclair. I'm 86 years old and I live alone in an aluminum trailer in the middle of the Arizona desert, where the wind sings at night and the sand holds more secrets than most books ever will. I was a Navy nurse during World War II, stationed in the South Pacific, in a battle most folks would rather forget, Okinawa. On that island, the sky wept more than the soldiers. And me. Well, I learned how to stitch flesh and patch up souls with my hands. But there was one wound I could never close. A war story that never made it into the history books. An emotional story that clings to me like a shadow. And it starts with an empty crib and ends with a face I recognized far too late. If you've made it this far, I ask you to stay a little longer. Sit with me, like someone visiting an old friend at sunset. Grab a cup of hot tea, or lukewarm coffee if that's what you've got, and let me tell you this war story that stayed buried for way too long. Maybe you'll see a piece of yourself in it, or maybe you'll hear what your mother never said out loud. But I ask just one thing. Listen until the end. Because some stories only make sense on the last page. If this story touches your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. If you'd like to hear more voices like mine, go ahead and subscribe. But for now, just listen. The secret is about to begin. Sometimes I think that ship wasn't a ship at all. It was a metal womb, hot, suffocating, cramped, and at the same time cold as damp steel at dawn. Inside it, war didn't have bombs or bullets. It hid in eyes that didn't blink, in hands that wouldn't let go, in missing limbs and blood-stained letters. It was a war of waiting and of broken resurrection. They called it a hospital ship, but if I'm being honest, it felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. I was stationed as a Navy nurse on the USS Mercy, anchored just off the coast of Okinawa. That island seemed to spit fire day and night, and every man who came through the surgical wing carried a piece of hell on his shoulders. But something changed that week. We received a group of civilians rescued by field teams. Women and children, displaced, starved, wounded, forgotten. Among them was a 12-year-old girl with a charred hand, an old woman who spoke only in murmurs, and a young woman who looked like she'd give birth, right there on the metal floor. They didn't tell us their names. There was no time for names. Just wrist tags. Civilian patient 47B, pregnant woman, no ID. I was on duty that night. The sea rocked slowly, but the nausea came from the soul. Chief Physician Lieutenant Collins pulled me aside and said, "She's going to deliver tonight. You're on her. But we don't have enough incubators," I whispered. He let out a sigh like someone who'd already given up on God. Then pray it doesn't survive. But it did. And that's when my real war story began. The one no one ever wrote down. The kind of story that doesn't fit in any official report. I cleaned the baby with a rough towel. It was a boy. Tiny, his skin tinged yellow from the strain. But strong. Strong like someone who's been fighting since before he was born. And the silence. That's what broke me. He didn't cry. Not a sound. The mother, barely conscious, looked at me like I was an angel or maybe a hangman. I don't know if she even saw her son. I doubt it. She bled so much the mattress turned black. I gave him a placeholder name. David. He looked like a boy who'd grow up to face giants. By morning, the mother was gone. I held her hand till the end. She was still warm when they took her body away, but she was already just a memory. And David, that silent newborn, was orphaned of everything. Origin, language, country. He was mine. The records officer suggested handing him over immediately to the Civilian Evacuation Command. Just another nameless baby, Nurse Sinclair. And like the obedient fool I always was, I nodded. But inside, my chest was screaming. I made a makeshift blanket from the clean supply cloths. Sewed into it was an old brooch from my mother, a golden camellia. She used to say camellias brought silence and protection. I pinned it to the corner, along the hem. I thought, he'll never know who gave him this, but maybe he'll feel it. When I handed him over, something inside me shattered. It felt like the ship itself was rejecting me, like that iron womb was pushing me out too. Later that day, while we were changing the sheets of a soldier who died in surgery, a young nurse asked me, "You okay, Dorothy?" And I said, "Just tired." But I was empty. That was my first secret, not the only one, but the first that cut through me like a scalpel. I went back to the barracks and wrote a letter to myself. In it, I described the baby's smell, the way he squeezed my finger, his warmth in my arms. I folded the letter and tucked it into my journal. I never read it again, but I never forgot it either. You know, sweetheart, in that war we saw bodies break open, but it was the invisible wounds that hurt the most. That war story marked me deeper than any battle, and that boy, the one who never cried, lived deep in my dreams, in silence, like everything that truly matters. The whole ship felt like it talked too much. Machines hissing, doctors barking orders, boots slamming the metal floors in a rush to save what everyone already knew was lost. But it was in that makeshift civilian ward that silence found me again. This time, in human form. She came in carried over the shoulders of 2 Marines. Dirty feet, hair plastered to her forehead, a deep gash across her hip, like a torn seam coming undone. "Is this woman mute?" the doctor asked. The soldiers glanced at each other. "Hasn't spoken since they found her. Just stares. And cries." Crying in that place was almost a luxury. As we cleaned her wounds, I noticed something none of the men seemed to catch. Her belly was tight, high, alive. She was very pregnant. No file, no name, no ID, just that battered body refusing to give up. I started calling her Leah, like my sister who died of fever when we were little. Leah didn't talk much either, but she loved Jasmine and told stories with her eyes. This Leah, the one on the ship, looked at me the same way, like she saw something in me I'd forgotten still existed. Every time I walked by her cot, she'd squeeze my wrist. Not hard, not in panic, just firm, as if to say, "You, only you hear me. In war, you learn to listen with your skin." And that's what I did. While everyone else saw her as just civilian patient 53, I cared for her like someone guarding a truth no one else wants to acknowledge. She didn't speak, but everything she did was full of grace. She responded to the sound of water, the smell of coffee, the distant hum of the radio when it still worked. One night, while I was changing her dressing, she touched my belly. I don't know why, but she looked at me like she was trying to ask something. Then she closed her eyes. The next morning, Leah went into labor. No anesthesia, no midwife, no one who understood her. It was me. I was the one who held her, who grabbed the sterilized scissors and whispered a prayer, who cut the cord and tried to hide the shaking in my hands. A boy was born, another boy, and again, silence. He cried, yes, but it was short, faint, like a distant echo. Then he fell asleep. He looked tired like all of us. And Leah, she looked at him like she was seeing the whole world. But she didn't reach out. She turned her face away. Tears soaked the pillow, but not a word came out. That moment I understood. She wasn't mute. She had been silenced. And war did that to women. It stole their voices, stole their autonomy, stole even their right to want. The next day, A captain from the admin unit came to me. "We need to transfer patient 53 and the newborn." "They're not registered," I said. He gave me that look men use when they want to seem kind but are just tired. "Then register them. Pick any name. We've got others to deal with." I went back to her bedside, held the baby, and asked with my eyes. She didn't answer, just looked at the brooch on my pocket, the metal camellia. I touched it. She nodded. That's how I decided. This boy would be David too, like the first. Like every motherless boy was somehow part of the same cycle, the same war. But this time, something in me started to break. I thought I knew how to separate love from duty, devotion from delusion. But I started feeling this irrational urge to protect that baby as if he were mine. And Leah seemed to know. 2 days later, she vanished. Rumors said she was transferred to the mainland, along with other wounded. But no records. No officer confirmed it. She simply disappeared. And the boy stayed. No name, no mother, no past. Just another secret in the basement of history. That night, I cried for the first time since I boarded. Cried alone in the empty mess hall, holding a cold bottle and a closed diary. And I started writing again. A new letter, a new attempt at remembering. But this time, I didn't mention names. Not Leah, not David. Because I realized names didn't save anyone there. They were just fragile veils covering what war ripped apart. That part of my war story was never recorded officially. Not in Navy reports, not in the hospital logs. But it's real, in every detail of my silence, and especially in the fact that one day, many years later, I would see a man with familiar eyes and steady hands and wonder, which one was he? The first? The second? Or just another of the many born in silence who grew up never knowing who called them son for the first time? I still wonder that. And maybe I'll keep wondering for a while longer. I was never good at goodbyes, especially the kind that don't hurt right away, but leave a bittersweet taste that spreads inside like tea that's gone too warm. That morning the sun looked more white than golden, like it too was tired of the war. The sea breeze carried a mix of salt and blood, and even with the ship anchored, everything inside me felt like it was still swaying. I knew it would be the last time I held that baby. David, the second, or maybe the same one reborn. I couldn't tell anymore. War taught us to blur faces, dates, feelings. But that boy, he carried a different kind of silence. He didn't wail. He watched. He looked at me with a kind of knowing that left me shaken. Like he understood, even in the womb, that his story would be ripped away before it even began. While I got him ready for transfer, hands trembling despite myself, I reached for the last clean blanket in the supply closet. It was small, bluish, a little rough to the touch, but still soft enough to guard the fragile skin of a newborn. I didn't want him to leave like all the others, wrapped in neutral, cold, functional cloths. I wanted to leave something of me, a trace, an invisible memory. That's when I pulled from my pocket the dried jasmine sachet I'd kept since the day I boarded the ship. It was tiny, nearly scentless after all those months. But when I pressed it between my fingers, a faint fragrance released itself, soft and familiar. It reminded me of my mother, of home, of mornings when I washed my face before school. It reminded me of who I was before the war, before the silence, before all the eyes I watched close for the last time in my hands. I tied the sachet to the blanket, hidden between its folds. No one would notice, but I would know, and maybe he would feel it too. I fastened, for the third time, the metal camellia brooch, the one I had tried not to part with. I knew I was giving away the last thing I had that still felt feminine, human, fragile. But I also knew that's what made me a real nurse. Not the bandages, not the reports, but this stubborn urge to protect, even when there was no chance of success. The Navy officer who came to take him was young, beautiful. Her eyes were steady, her pace rushed. She held the baby gently but without attachment. And that infuriated me. How could someone carry a secret in their arms with such ease? I, who felt my bones ache with longing before he was even gone, almost screamed. But I swallowed it down, like I always did. As she walked away down the corridor, with him facing backward, I caught one last glimpse of his little face. He wasn't crying. He wasn't asleep, just watching me. And in that gaze was something I've never been able to put into words. A kind of farewell that felt like a promise, or maybe a plea. Something like, remember me, even if I never come back. And I did. I walked back to my quarters like a woman who left her suitcase at the dock. I felt hollow, like my body was still upright, but my soul had shipped off with him. The radio played a slow song, broken up by static. I sat at the edge of my bed and just stayed there, listening to the sea hum against the hull, trying to convince myself this was right, necessary, standard. But it wasn't. That night I pulled out the diary I kept hidden under my mattress and wrote another letter to no one. I described the scent of the jasmine, the feel of the blanket, the way he curled when he shifted sides. I made up a birthday for him, a zodiac sign, a favorite color. It was my way of keeping him from dissolving into time like so many others had. And in that letter, I promised myself that if I ever saw that brooch again, or caught that scent in the wind, I would know. I would recognize it. Because war stories don't end when the bombs stop falling. They continue in the absences, the forgotten objects, the promises no one hears. And my greatest secret, the one that would follow me for decades, was this. I had held my own son without knowing it, and let him go, because the world said it was the right thing. Because no one ever let me believe otherwise. Because being a nurse meant taking care of everyone, except yourself. Since that day, I've never looked at a baby blanket without thinking of missing arms. I've never caught the scent of jasmine on the wind without remembering what I lost. And every time someone tells me my life was a calling, I smile politely, because no calling survives without a cost, and mine still sleeps somewhere in the folds of my memory, wrapped in a blue blanket that smells of dried flowers. Some people come back from war with visible scars. I came back with silence, a silence that stuck to my skin like dust. You can't wash off, even with boiling water. There was no music on that flight home, no friendly voices, no applause or pats on the back. Just a narrow aisle, worn-out seats, women in uniform trying not to cry, and me sitting among them, dry-eyed but soaked inside. I sat near the wing, clutching a small bag in my lap, hiding the last pages I'd written on the ship. The letters I never sent, the promises I couldn't keep. The baby wasn't with me anymore. And even though I knew he was never truly mine, it still hurt as if he were. Worse, it hurt as if he were the last one. As if that small creature had carried off the only part of me still capable of dreaming. And the world outside went on, never knowing. When the plane flew over the American coast, I saw the city lights and wished that maybe, just maybe, one of those glowing windows belonged to him. That somewhere that baby was in a crib right now, another woman rocking him to sleep, with no idea he had once been handed over by a nurse who never managed to sleep in peace again. I wanted to believe that. But the truth is, every war story has gaps, detours, and some things can't be fixed with paperwork. I came back as a veteran, sure, but no one saw me as a hero. They looked at me like I was just another one. Just another nurse with dull eyes, soft steps, and calloused hands. Like we'd all been trained to disappear once the war ended. My sister picked me up at the airport. She gave me a shy hug and drove me straight to the house where we grew up, deep in Missouri. The house felt smaller. The smell of apple pie had long been replaced by mold and memories. I walked into my old bedroom and sat on the bed, where everything was the same. Except me. My body was there, but my soul was still dragging its feet through the metal hallways of the USS Mercy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the boy. David. The second. Sometimes the first. Or maybe a mix of both. And it slowly drove me mad in silence, because there was no name, no birth certificate, no proof. Just a heavy, wordless ache in my chest. A secret with no witnesses. I tried to get back to civilian life. I landed a job at a veterans hospital. The irony wasn't lost on me. I cared for men who came home with broken bodies, while I myself was just a shadow, smiling, nodding, but unraveling on the inside. No one noticed, not even the doctors I worked with for 20 years. I was the one who knew when to give morphine, how to turn a body without pain, what to whisper when someone was dying. I was the one who calmed the difficult ones, comforted the hopeless, handled the impossible. But not once, in all those years, did anyone ask me who I had lost. The nights were the worst. I dreamed of empty cribs, of folded blankets that smelled like jasmine, of golden camellias sinking in bathtubs. I dreamed someone knocked on my door holding a brooch, or an envelope with a baby's cry inside. And I'd wake up with a wet face, not knowing if I'd cried or just sweated. I started writing again, but only on loose sheets tucked between my bedsheets. I wrote like someone stitching their own skin. Fragile thread, crooked seams, but the will to not completely fall apart. The war story I carried, that deeply emotional story no one wanted to hear, became a sort of silent religion. My altar was memory. My confessional, a pillow. At veterans' gatherings, the other nurses talked about love affairs cut short, soldiers they kissed for 3 days and never saw again. I'd smile and listen but said nothing, because what I lost didn't fit into those kinds of stories. It wasn't a romance, it was a root, a part of my own body handed over without knowing if it would return. And it didn't. Or maybe it did. But through paths I still don't understand. I began studying the faces of my friends' sons, looking for familiar features. A gaze, the shape of a jaw, a scar. And sometimes I saw it, or thought I did. Because when your heart aches too long, your brain starts inventing ways to cope. And I clung to those delusions with the same hope people save for miracles. I never told anyone. Not my sister. Not the few men I got close to over the years. I dodged questions about motherhood with a polite smile. And whenever someone asked why I never had kids, I'd answer, the war took up that space, and they'd accept it. No one suspected that my body remembered a weight that was no longer there, that my arms, even now, sometimes fold, as if cradling the air, that my memory still smells like dried flowers and iron. Silence followed me for decades, like a loyal dog, always at my side. Through every house move, every hospital shift, every changing season. It became my most constant companion, and I fed it with secrets, with memories, with hopes I never dared say out loud. Because some war stories aren't told in words, they're felt, like a song no one else hears, but that still plays in some corner of your soul. And back then, I knew only one thing. If I ever saw him, if my son ever crossed my path, even if he didn't know who I was, I would recognize him, If only by the scent of jasmine. If only by the silence we shared. We cling to strange things when we can't speak. I, for one, clung to paper. Cheap paper, yellowed over time, the kind that smudges with a sweaty hand. I bought my first pads at a supply store in Tucson on a random late afternoon. One of those where the sky looks like someone sketched it in chalk. I had gone in for flour and matches, but I left with envelopes and a box of pens. It was like something inside me whispered, "Start. Doesn't matter if there's no end. Just start." I wrote the first letter sitting on the back porch. The radio turned so low the music sounded more like memory than sound. I spoke to him like he was sleeping nearby, wrapped in that blue blanket that had lived in my mind all those years. "Dear boy of silence," I wrote. "Today the wind felt drier than usual, and while I was washing the teacups I thought of your face. Not the one I saw when you were a baby, but the one I imagine now." I kept going for 5 pages, describing how I thought his voice might sound, the kind of food he'd like, the little habits he might have inherited from me. I signed it, "From your almost mother," then folded it carefully and tucked it inside an old cigar box, alongside some faded photos and a button from a uniform I no longer wore. That was the first of many. I lost count after the 20th. Some were long, full of details and questions. Others were short, more like notes. "I dreamed of you today." Or, "I wonder if you like the rain." Some weeks I wrote every day. Other times I'd go months without a word, as if my soul were on strike. But what I never did, not once, was send them. There was no address, no real name, and worst of all, no permission. Deep down, I knew the world didn't want me to have that child. I was just a nurse, a woman of service, not ownership. Someone who cares, not someone who keeps. The letters became my secret ritual. Writing them reminded me that somewhere out there might be a piece of me, loose in the world. A boy who maybe grew up never knowing he was hoped for. That he was remembered. That he was loved in the dark. There were days I almost mailed them. I'd put an envelope in my purse, walk all the way to the town's mailbox, but I'd always stop a few steps away. I imagined the postal clerk asking, "Name of the recipient, ma'am?" And there I'd be, mute, ashamed, as if loving someone in silence were a crime. Once I went to a military adoption center, pretending to be searching for a distant relative. I had written down dates, protocol numbers, all based on what I remembered from the ship. The woman at the desk received me coldly, said that without a name, without an official number, without proper documentation, she couldn't help me. I smiled, thanked her, left with teary eyes and a dry throat. I went home in silence, a fresh envelope in my pocket, and another new letter ready to be born. It's strange how war keeps going even after you take off the uniform. In my case, it continued on paper. Every line I wrote was an emotional trench, every period a quiet surrender. I wrote like someone fighting, like someone stitching a handkerchief by hand, knowing they'd never get to hand it to the one who matters. I wrote because I needed the memory to stay alive, even if only for me. Even if it was just an echo in a desert no one answers. With time, my letters changed. At first, they were confessions. Later, they turned into advice. Mom letters, even if I'd never been called that. I wrote about how to choose friends, how to treat women, how to listen before speaking. I wrote about politics, about faith, about books, even about how to cook beans. Maybe it was silly, but it made me feel present. Like somehow, in some strange dimension, I was still guiding that boy. Like maybe someday, he'd find those words and recognize me in them. Not by name, but by tone, by the tenderness disguised as silence, And that is how it still is. I still have the box. I've replaced the rubber bands, patched up the hinges. Every time I move, it rides in my lap. I've thought about burning it all, you know? A symbolic fire, like letting the past go with the smoke. But I've never been able to, because those pages, they're all I have of him. They're the only bridge I ever built alone, with no help, no map, just instinct and longing. Some nights I reread a few, with the lights low and the radio crackling. On those nights, I almost hear small footsteps on the wooden floor. I almost see a tall boy with dark eyes standing in the doorway, holding a letter in his hand. And I wait for him to say, "This handwriting, it's yours, isn't it?" But he never does, because he hasn't arrived yet. Or maybe he already passed by me, without ever knowing I was the one who'd been waiting. It's strange how time shapes us without a sound. One day you wake up and realize you've stopped waiting for the phone to ring. You don't glance out the window as often. The box of letters becomes just another piece of furniture, no longer an altar. But even when everything seems to have settled into silence, there are eyes that still pierce through. And that's how I noticed. I noticed the very second it happened. It was a sweltering late afternoon in Tucson. The hospital was buzzing with renovations, new doctors arriving, and I, officially retired but still volunteering, was tidying cabinets, organizing old files, and telling stories to veterans who only slept if someone called them by their full names. That day, somewhere between a delivery of new blankets and the nurse's shift change, he walked in, tall, composed, clothes too neatly pressed for desert heat. He didn't look around with arrogance, but with a kind of calm that hurt. Because it was the gaze of someone who recognized a place before ever stepping foot in it. Like he'd already been there, even if he hadn't. And when he turned to me, greeting me with that polite smile, everything froze. The hallway, the flickering lights, the phone ringing in the distance. It wasn't his face, not the nose, not the mouth. It was the way he looked. And his eyes. Those dark, unhurried eyes. That kind of gaze that doesn't demand a response. It just listens. I knew that silence. It was the same silence that passed through me when I placed a baby in another woman's arms. The same silence that made me write letters for 40 years to someone who never wrote back. He said, "I'm the new general practitioner, Dr. Elias Jordan." And I nearly collapsed. Elias. Not David, not Samuel, not Elijah like in all the names I'd imagined in those letters. But still, it fit. And in that moment, I knew. Or rather, something in me knew. My head spun, my stomach twisted, and my heart, which hadn't rushed for anything in years, stumbled in my chest. I tried to smile, tried to pretend it was just another day, just another young doctor stepping into an old hospital. But the body doesn't lie. Hands tremble, eyes give you away. And inside, the memories began clicking into place like puzzle pieces, finally coming home. In the days that followed, I tried avoiding him. But life, when it wants to, pushes. And the hospital seemed to enjoy the game. Every time I picked up a clipboard, he'd be in the hallway. When I left the records room, he'd be coming the other way. And in each of those small collisions, his silence told me more than any word could. It wasn't coincidence. It was repetition. It was echo. And I, who had spent a lifetime avoiding the question, began to observe. I noticed his hands. Long, careful. The way he spoke to patients, as if every word needed to be said just right, as if he knew the value of silence. There was tenderness in him, and something that, I swear, felt like it had come from me. I asked the secretary about him. Nothing invasive, just enough to confirm he'd been adopted, that he never knew his birth mother, that he was born in 1945, near the end of the war, in the Pacific. The details were few. And even if they'd been complete, it didn't matter. Because deep down, my heart had already decided. It was him. Or it was what was left of him. What remained of that silent surrender in a hallway that smelled of iodine. And that certainty terrified me. Because now, he was here. Alive. Present. But unaware. He had no idea who I was. And maybe he never could. I spent sleepless nights wondering if I should tell him. I mentally sifted through every letter, trying to choose which one I'd give him, if any of them would even be enough. If I'd have the courage at all. I once brought them to the hospital, hidden in a brown paper bag. But I froze in the parking lot, just like I'd frozen in front of so many mailboxes before. I looked at the building and thought, what if he hates me? What if he thinks I abandoned him on purpose? What if he already has a mother, a life, a love built without me? And I just sat there, with the AC running, waiting for time to decide for me. But time, when we need it most, pretends not to hear. The only thing I could manage was to stay close, to be there when he needed help with an elderly patient, to be the invisible figure who fixed what no one else noticed. I was good at that. I always had been. The nurse who preps the room before the doctor walks in. The woman who moves unnoticed but carries everything, including the pain, including the love. Then one day he looked at me differently. It was subtle, a second longer, a gaze that lingered, as if something clicked. Maybe it was the jasmine scent on my blouse. Maybe it was the golden brooch I'd started pinning to my collar again, quietly. He didn't say a word, just smiled. And I replied with the smallest gesture, like someone who recognizes, even without certainty. And that's when I understood. Life doesn't always give us cinematic reunions. Sometimes it gives us quiet encounters. And eyes that meet, even if they never learn the name that once tied them together. We fool ourselves into thinking time hides everything. That if we stay quiet enough, invisible enough, some truths will dissolve like sugar in coffee. But it doesn't work that way. Some things come back, and when they do, they don't ask permission. That morning felt ordinary. The kind of day where the hospital halls smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. I was sorting through old files, folding sheets, updating patient forms forgotten in a cabinet that reeked of mothballs, when Dr. Elias called me. He asked for help with a veteran who refused to be touched by anyone. An old, thin man with lost eyes and skin, marked by some war that had never ended. Elias treated him with a kind of tenderness that disarmed me. He used silence. He used pauses. He used presence. He didn't say, "You'll be okay." He just said, "I'm here." Well, like he understood that for some pain, being there was enough. And in that gesture I knew again, he had something of mine. After the consult, we went to his office. He asked me to retrieve an old report stored in one of the locked cabinets. He stepped away for a moment and I, distracted, pulled the wrong drawer. A dark wooden one, worn with time. What I saw inside wasn't supposed to be there. Not anywhere. It was a small velvet box, open, and inside, my brooch, the golden camellia. A little worn from age, but unmistakable. My heart jumped, hard and dry. I would recognize that brooch among 1,000. It was the same one I had pinned to the baby's blanket, the one I tucked in like a whisper. And now, there it was, in his drawer, like a relic. I froze, breathless, as if even the slightest sound might give away my shock. He came back before I could figure out what to do. I closed the drawer, slowly, my hands trembling, and handed him the report like nothing had happened. He thanked me with a calm smile, as if the world was still in perfect order. But mine had quietly collapsed. I left the room slowly, without a word, walked the hallway like I was crossing a minefield, and when I reached the back office, I sat alone, breathing somewhere between past and present. My brooch, with him. The same one I had stitched onto the blue blanket, the same one I'd written about in letters, dreamed about, mourned. How could it be there? How did he have it? Did someone find it and give it back? Did his adoptive mother keep it as a keepsake? Or did he know? Did he carry it by instinct? Like a memory without origin. My head throbbed, and all those letters I'd written over the decades began swirling inside me like loose leaves in the wind. I spent the rest of the day in suspension. The hospital kept spinning, with its alarms, its clipboards, its rushing footsteps. But all I could see was that brooch. The past stitched right back into my present. Night fell without warning, and the desert outside seemed to be watching me. I sat for hours in the worn-out chair inside my trailer, holding one of the first letters I ever wrote him. If one day you find something small and golden, and you don't know where it came from, keep it. It's my way of reminding you that love doesn't die. It just changes its name. I had written that almost without thinking. Now it felt like prophecy. I thought about confronting him, about asking, about telling. But fear is a kind of illness no one cures. Fear of not being recognized, fear of shattering a life already built, fear of being rejected, or worse, fear of being welcomed and not knowing what to do with it. Because when you spend so many years loving in the dark, you forget how to stand in the light. And I had made my peace with the dark. It was my home, my clothing, my way of walking. So I didn't tell him. Not that day. I just wrote another letter, the shortest one yet. It said only, I saw. I folded it, tucked it away, and laid down with a heart heavy as lead. The brooch was the proof. But it was also a riddle, an invitation, a chance. And I still didn't know if I had the courage to accept it. Because sometimes, being found is harder than being lost. Especially when what you find is part of a secret you've spent a lifetime trying to forget. And never could. Some truths aren't born from words. They're born from long silences, brief gestures, glances that last half a second longer than they should. And that's exactly how it happened. The confession, if I can even call it that, didn't come in a letter, or a hidden note, or one of those teary-eyed conversations we see in movies. It came in the parking lot, with the sky starting to bleed into dusk and the desert heat softening the air. It was a Friday. I remember because it smelled like Friday. That kind of tired relief, mixed with the squeak of stretcher wheels and the distant click of someone locking a door that no longer wanted to open. I was leaving later than usual. I'd stayed behind organizing old records, maybe out of distraction, maybe just needing something for my hands to do. As I zipped my purse, the brooch I'd been wearing for days slipped out and fell to the ground. The golden camellia. The same one I'd seen in his drawer. I bent down to pick it up, and in that moment I heard footsteps. It was him, Dr. Elias, walking toward me with that quiet stride of his, always carrying some kind of question in his posture. He looked at me, then at the brooch in my hand, and said nothing. A silence stretched between us, the exact length between sunset and the first star. I didn't speak. I just stood up slowly, held the brooch tight, and looked at him like, somehow, my gaze could reach across time, across the ocean, across the ship, the blanket, the birth, the surrender. He didn't speak either, but what I saw in his eyes, it wasn't emptiness. It was memory. It was echo, Like something in him recognized something in me, even if it had no name, no shape, no logical explanation. Like his body remembered my skin, my scent, the beat of my heart the first time I held him. We stood there for a few seconds that felt like an eternity made of wind and sand. The parking lot was nearly empty. The only sounds were the hum of the building's ventilation and the dry whistle of the breeze. And then he said, in a voice so soft it almost disappeared, "I've always kept that brooch. I don't know why." I took a deep breath. Everything in me wanted to say, because it was mine, because I pinned it there, because I loved you before I knew who you'd become. But I didn't. I simply answered, "Some things we hold on to, because our body knows before our mind does." He smiled, a small smile like he was holding back tears. Then he turned serious, looked at me, and said something that completely undid me. "You've taken care of me before, haven't you?" It wasn't a casual question. It wasn't about shifts or patients or hospital rounds. It was about another time, another life, a place only we knew, even if we didn't fully remember. My throat went dry. My chest trembled. I wanted to hug him, but I didn't move. Instead, I placed the brooch in his palm, closed his fingers around it, and whispered, "It's yours." He didn't argue, didn't ask anything. He just held my hand for a moment, like someone holding fate. And in that brief, silent touch, everything was said. We didn't need birth certificates, DNA, or labels. That was recognition. Not the legal kind, the spiritual kind, the invisible kind. The kind only two souls stitched together by the same thread can understand. The kind only someone who once handed her child to the sea and later found him on the dry sands of the desert can decipher. In the days that followed, we continued our routines. We didn't change the way we spoke to each other at the hospital. There was no new conversation, no embrace, no grand revelation. But our silences became gentler, and now and then our eyes would meet with tenderness, with care, with the kind of quiet reverence you give to someone who carries a missing piece of your story. And it taught me something I only learned far too late. Not every love has to be spoken. Sometimes, loving is recognizing, letting it exist, not needing a reply. Some images aren't taken by cameras. They're taken by the heart. And they stay there, still and clear, like a portrait that never fades. It was on a Sunday morning, a few months after that silent exchange in the parking lot, that this truth revealed itself to me. The hospital was closed to visitors for electrical maintenance, and Tucson's heat had finally eased up. The sky, clearer than usual, looked like a sheet hung out to dry. I was sitting on the bench outside the hospital, waiting for the maintenance technician to finish checking the outlets in the south wing, when Elias showed up with 2 cups of coffee. One black, for him. One with milk, for me. I didn't have to ask. He just knew. And that kind of knowing can't be taught. It's felt. He sat beside me, quiet. We drank slowly, talked about the weather, the renovations, the veterans who made up symptoms just to have someone to talk to. We laughed a little, a soft laugh, held back, almost respectful. Like our souls were 2 polite old ladies sharing tea for the first time. Then he stood up and offered to drive me home. I refused at first, out of habit, but he insisted, and I gave in, like someone accepting a kindness that already felt like destiny. We got into his car, an old sedan, too clean to be used every day. And inside, in that quiet space between the key turning and the engine starting, my heart began to slow down, as if it knew something was about to happen. We took the road that leads to my trailer, a straight road, flanked by dry bushes and barbed wire fences. But that day, it felt longer, and time felt like it was shifting into reverse. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't talk much, just drove with the same calm that reminded me, again, of someone who once fell asleep in my arms. Then, as we rounded a gentle curve, sunlight came in through the side window and hit the rearview mirror, and there, fastened with a faded strip of tape, was my face, or rather, that photograph, the one taken on the ship. The only one where I wore the full uniform, hair tucked under the white cap, the brooch on my collar. That photo I thought was lost, left in some Navy box forgotten. But there it was, aged, yellowed, with a crease in the upper corner, taped to the inside of his mirror. My heart stopped for a moment. The world went silent, and before I could say anything, he spoke. She's been with me for years. Never knew who she was. Just knew she calmed me somehow. I turned slowly, trying to stay composed, trying to stop the tears, but they were already there. How could I explain that the woman in that photo was the one who brought him into the world with trembling hands and a broken chest? That this image was the only proof of the one time I was a mother, but couldn't say I was? All I could do was nod, a gesture of thanks for something too deep to name. He didn't ask how I reacted, didn't press, just kept driving, like that photograph was more than an image, like it was a compass, and it was. We reached my trailer in silence. He parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment. Then he turned to me and said, "That photo, it smells like an old hospital and dried flowers." I smiled. "It's jasmine," I replied. He nodded like something finally made sense. And then, just before I got out, he placed his hand over mine and said, "Even if you never say it, I know." It was the only time he came that close to the truth with words, and it was all I needed. I stepped out of the car with my heart brimming with pain and gratitude, walked slowly into my trailer, legs unsteady, and sat on the edge of my bed. The sun was setting, and the desert outside seemed to exhale. That night I wrote the final letter, the one I never meant to send. I used my fine-tipped blue pen on thick paper and wrote, "You found me without knowing, and I recognized you without permission, but now we are whole, even if only in silence." I tucked it in with the others, and I slept with the window open, like someone who finally let the past come home. Life doesn't return things the way it took them. Sometimes it gives them back in a different form, at another time, through another door. And that's how he came back to me. Not as a boy, not as a patient, not exactly as a son, but as a presence. As something you recognize without needing to name. After that day with the photograph in the rearview mirror, he started coming by more often, always with some casual excuse, bringing cornbread from a market I liked, asking about an old patient, or just sitting with me on the porch to listen to the wind whistle through the cacti. And I let him. I let him because I felt he knew. Even without knowing how, we both knew. And that was enough. One afternoon he showed up with a portable radio in his hands, said he'd fixed my old one, the one that hadn't worked in years. He turned it on slowly, adjusted the dial, and as if timed with memory itself, a song from the 1940s began to play. It was a tune I used to hear on the ship while folding clean linens and writing my first letters. My chest tightened. He looked at me gently and said, "Thought you might miss it." I smiled, eyes damp, and whispered, "Didn't think anyone noticed." He lowered the volume, and without looking directly at me said, "I always noticed." It cut through me like a sweet blade. And right then I understood. He didn't need to know the whole story to feel he belonged to it. And I, after all those years trying to forget, finally understood it was no longer about hiding. It was about letting the truth breathe. With time, he began calling me nurse. He never called me mother, and I never expected him to. But there was tenderness in that nickname, a kind of reverence dressed as affection. Every time he said nurse, I heard, "I see you." We began creating our own rituals. Sunday mornings became cornbread and coffee time. Thursday afternoons, short walks around the trailer. He'd lead me to the fence, point at the clouds, say it was going to rain, and laugh when I corrected him. We shared long silences and small stories, as if intimacy could be built, quietly, in little gestures. And the most beautiful thing was that neither of us ever needed to confirm what we knew, because something sacred lived between us: care. And care is a form of love that doesn't need a birth certificate. One day he invited me to the sea, said he needed to see the ocean again, even if just for a day. I hesitated. It had been decades since I'd seen the sea. I was afraid it would remind me of everything. But I went. He drove for hours, the radio playing low, the same old playlist, the same photograph taped to the rearview mirror. When we arrived, the sun was setting. The sky was copper-colored, and the sea matched the shade of the uniform I wore the day I gave him away. We walked slowly across the wet sand. He offered his arm, and I took it, like someone grabbing a bridge between two lives. And there, facing the vastness of the ocean, he said, "Maybe this is all we ever need. Solid ground." And someone beside us. I didn't answer. I just stood there, salt soaking into my shoes, tears drying on my face, and for the first time, I felt whole. That boy I never got to cry over now walked beside me, not as a ghost from the past, but as a living presence. We drove home in silence, and at the door, he gave me a long hug, the kind that doesn't say, "See you later," but "I'm here." And as he walked away, I looked back and whispered to myself, "You were born to me again." Because that's what he did. He was born to me again. After all those years, after all those letters, after so many silences stitched with pain, he was born to me. And even if he never calls me mother, even if he never says it out loud, he knows. I know. And the whole desert seems to know too. Some things we don't bury. We just fold and keep, like a grandmother's embroidered handkerchief we never had the courage to use. My secret didn't die. It just changed shape. Became memory in the eyes of a man who doesn't know he was waited for, became presence in the passenger seat, jasmine scent in an old radio, a golden camellia resting in his palm. And if you made it this far, listening to this war story of mine, this emotional story, thank you, because telling it is also stitching the soul, stitch by stitch, thread by thread, until the emptiness stops hurting so much. Yes, I was a nurse in the war. I stitched wounds of people who never walked again, washed the blood of men who never said, "Thank you," whispered comfort to bodies slipping away before dawn. But my deepest wound wasn't the war. It was the silence it left inside me, the silence of having loved a child without being allowed to call him mine, of having written 100 letters and mailed none, of having spent a life waiting for a gaze, and when it came, not having the courage to say, "It's you." But sometimes, love settles for less, for shared coffee, a photo in a mirror, a hand that lingers without urgency. He never called me mother, and I never needed him to, because he stayed, and staying is a form of recognition, maybe the most beautiful one. If this story touched something forgotten inside you, some longing, some name you never got to say, I invite you to leave a comment below, like someone writing a letter they never dared to send. Tell me what you felt, or just stay silent with me. Silence sometimes speaks louder than 1,000 words, And if you'd like to keep hearing stories like this, whispered by women who were once forgotten, but have now decided to open the windows of their hearts, I invite you to subscribe. Just click. No rush, no pressure. Like sitting beside a grandmother at dusk and listening without interrupting. Because here, everything that was silenced finds a voice. And may you, my dear, also one day find what life forgot to return to you.